So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for those in the room for braving the bad weather. After we had a run of sun, the rain is back, although it seems like not the extended pattern that we were in previously. So welcome today to our monthly Adaptation Community Meeting. My name is Chris Perrine. I'm the Chief of Party for the Atlas Project, which is a USAID-funded adaptation program. And we host these monthly events here. The events are, generally speaking, on the third Thursday of every month. They cover a broad range of topics related to adaptation. And so I will turn the event over to our moderator and one of our speakers, Peter Panshin, in just a minute. But first, just a couple of general notes. If you don't already get notification of these events and all kinds of other good information, you can do that by signing up on Climatelinks.org, and you'll get notifications about these events and, as I say, other good information related to adaptation. Let's see, what else? The next event will be on April 18th. April 18th. The topic is the integration of climate information into water resources management. And it, again, will be a panel discussion. I think 3 projects, USAID-funded projects from various places in the world. So interesting stuff. I encourage everyone to come for that or listen in online. And I think that's it. So without further ado, I will turn the mic over to Pete, and he will take it away, I think, with the first presentation.
Chris? Well, I'm excited to be here today, and in part to be able to share my role as a panelist with my fellow panelists. Something that is exciting about this to me is that I work directly with my colleagues here or others from their organizations in a partnership called the Climate Services for Resilient Development Partnership. And one of the working groups that we have in there is a heat working group. And we try to work towards raising awareness around the issue of climate extremes, climate heat, and human health. So, and then I'm also just excited to be here today because this is an important point on the map of just more general awareness raising on this issue of heat health. So my name is Pete Panshin. I'm with the USAID Climate Office, and I'll start off with a presentation, but I'll first introduce my colleagues. We have Ruth Singh with the, I left my cheat sheet of your titles. We have Ruth Singh with the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. She's a climate risk advisor based in New York. And Wasila Chow, a meteorologist with NOAA. He's the team leader for the Climate Prediction Center in the International Desks program. And Hunter Jones, also with NOAA. He's a climate and health projects manager in the Climate Program Office. So glad to have all of our panelists here. Thank you. So, oops, I also need this, clicker. So climate change and heat waves and extreme heat are bringing new and emerging health threats. And acute heat stress has been recognized as a growing cause of death around the world. And addressing extreme heat is starting to gain traction on the development agenda, and that's a very positive thing. Climate change is often described as a threat multiplier because it can exacerbate a wide range of existing interrelated non-climate stressors that impact food security, water security, peace, and stability. And in this way, climate change is a stress multiplier on health. And today we're focused specifically on extreme heat. And the heat waves can have adverse direct effects on our health, but they also put pressure on vulnerable systems and populations and resources, and they can exacerbate existing health issues. And so today I'll be talking about some of the work that USAID has done to help kind of push this agenda point further in terms of raising awareness And recently, a technical report was made publicly available on heat waves and human health. And this was something that USAID commissioned, and it was led by the Atlas team, specifically a group of excellent authors. It's available on Climatelinks.org. There's actually a couple copies of it outside. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at it, I highly recommend you grab it and download it and share it with your colleagues. So the report provides an important starting point for informing risk management in a warming world. And it brings in a bunch of examples and experiences from the developing context. It covers the basics, explaining what climate risk is, what heat health, what extreme events are, what heat waves are, giving the physical characteristics of them, how they impact human health. Sorry, is the microphone good? We're good?
Anything else?
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. If you could just mute your mics if you're on the line. And the report looks at the evidence that points to a warming world and with more frequent, more extreme heat events, and kind of chronicles what that might mean for human health and the types of risks that will bring with it. And then having set the stage in terms of what the mechanics around heat waves and human health are, the report then pivots to action and what can be done to reduce vulnerability of populations in order to better cope with heat waves at the individual level, community level, and national levels even. So getting started, let's just make sure that we can all get on the same page in terms of the direct and indirect effects of heat stress on health. So this is just a quick conceptual model overview of pathways that heat stress takes. So let's look at the direct effects. Extreme events can make living and working conditions unbearable, and they can have direct impacts on our health through heat stroke, other diseases including cardiovascular, respiratory diseases, renal diseases, and so clearly these can have impacts on our health, even lethal impacts. And this can ripple out across the health sector and into economic productivity. These can cause economic losses at the individual, at the household level, at national scales as well. And heat stress can also play out with indirect effects on critical systems. And so if we've got a heat event stressing our freshwater resources, agricultural production systems, and air quality, then those direct impacts translate into indirect impacts on our health. Again, by reducing water security, reducing food security, worsening air quality, and again, translating back into health problems and potentially premature death with, of course, reduced economic productivity. So this conceptual model is an oversimplified relationship between heat and health, and the extent and severity of extreme heat impacts really do vary depending upon the physical characteristics of a heat event, as well as the underlying vulnerability of the populations that are affected by extreme heat. So in that sense, heat exposure, heat vulnerability is a multidimensional problem, and there's both physical factors and social context that influence vulnerability. So for example, in urban areas, you can have the heat urban islands that have higher temperatures than rural areas, and even within urban areas, there can be variation in terms of the heat. So that's how heat can vary across. It's just one example of how heat can vary across space and presenting a physical factor that influences vulnerability. But vulnerability can also be influenced by economic status, with the poor being more vulnerable than people with resources to draw upon. Vulnerability varies with age. The elderly, the young are more vulnerable. People with pre-existing physical disabilities or health conditions are more vulnerable. Pregnant women. And then there can be cultural differences. So for example, if there's if a heat event coincides with the observance of a religious fasting period, there can be an uptick in heat-related injuries that are associated with dehydration. And similarly, gender can play out in, with different cultural norms around the division of labor and who has access to resources, who might have access to recreational cooling to help reduce vulnerability. So vulnerability itself is multidimensional, and just going back to this, it's a more complex relationship than just these simple linear lines. But understanding that is very important so that we can figure out, who are those vulnerable populations? How can we best target them? And the good news in all of this is that we actually have technology and the ability to forecast events and have heat information that we can use and draw upon. And we also know some behavioral responses that can be appropriately incorporated into and paired with heat information to be able to reduce vulnerability within populations. It's just a matter of curating all of this information together into systems that are disseminated out and reaching the right people who are at most risk. And so, for example, at the municipal level, heat health action plans can be developed that help to institutionalize heat risk management. And here in Ahmedabad, India, this is an example of that comes from their heat health action plan. And this really gets at the level of pinpointing individuals and institutions with specific roles and responsibilities, and it gets at the very sector-specific components in terms of what can be done and who should be doing what under a heat event. So, for example, parks, zoos, and swimming areas, they should have extended hours. Parks can provide shade if these resources are available within the city. What can schools be doing to better serve their student body populations, and how might they better be able to serve the populations more broadly, to provide sheltering stations or to pair with water resource providers to make sure that there's clean, safe water available? Who are the points of contact within hospitals for hospital management, not just to better manage anybody who might be coming in with heat-related illnesses, but also the population of injured people or sick people that they're already working with. And this goes on. There's the energy sector, there's transportation sector, labor sector. So, but having these points of contact with specific roles and responsibilities is fantastic. And there needs to be something that's a part of this heat health action plan that would actually get this triggered. So that's where a heat early warning system comes in. And so Ahmedabad they've identified temperature thresholds that would trigger components of the heat health alert. And we can see that there's, depending on the temperature, there might be extreme or just a no alert, and they have it color-coded. And so this is a very important component that brings the forecast information together with behavioral change, and so that between this we can have reduced vulnerability and appropriate actions taken by the populations. Having these in place is fantastic. However, it shouldn't stop there. We need to continue to examine these and to understand what makes them work well, interrogate them on their weaknesses, figure out how they can be improved, iterate on them, adaptively manage to improve them. And I'll just end by saying that that really with the right amount of resources and the political will, we're able to really address heat health. And with that, I'll pass it on to my colleague, Ruth Singh, with the Red Cross, Red Crescent Climate Center. Thank you, Ruth. Here is your clicker.
Thank you, Pete. Can everyone hear me? Yep. So as Pete mentioned, my name is Ruth Singh. I work with the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, which is a climate reference center to the global Red Cross Red Crescent movement. So for example, the American Red Cross is part of that movement, but we have 190 national societies all over the world focused on disasters and sort of being the first people to respond to disasters. So heat has become an increasing problem for the Red Cross. So this is a picture in Portugal during some of the fires and extreme heat a couple years ago with a Red Cross volunteer talking to an elderly man. This is something that the Red Cross has been working on for quite a while now in terms of reaching out to vulnerable populations like the elderly during heat events. So what I'm going to talk about are, I'm going to start off by telling you what are the 3 most important things that I think everyone in this room should know about heat. Then I'm going to talk about where I think some of the gaps are in terms of our knowledge, some of the opportunities, and then I'm going to end with what is the Red Cross doing about it. So 3 critical things to know. The first one, as has already been mentioned, is that extreme heat kills. So I don't know if you can see this, but the 2010 heat wave in Russia killed over 55,000 people. Now heat is actually notoriously an underreported, deaths of heat are underreported because oftentimes you're not going to see heat wave as the cause of death on a death certificate. It's rather things like cardiac arrest or related sort of medical issues. So oftentimes deaths aren't even attributed to heat. So we don't actually know how many people are killed by heat every year. The second thing is that it's one of the most obvious and confident projections that we have of the future. So the most recent IPCC report on 1.5 degrees said that hot extremes are projected to increase in most inhabited regions, and it's very confident, it's highly confident in this finding. And essentially this map is just to show you that yes, everywhere is red. It's going to get hotter everywhere. And the last one is that the solutions are simple. So this is the Indian Red Cross distributing water during a heat wave in one of the states in India. So the actual actions that you would take to prevent heat are quite simple. They're things like distributing drinking water. They might be avoiding being out in the day during the hottest time, or reducing your exposure to direct sunlight. It might be checking in on elderly people or your neighbors who might be more exposed to heat. So now that we know that, one of the biggest gaps that we've observed as a Red Cross working internationally has been the research on heat. So I'm going to use this paper that was released in 2017. It's called Global Risk of Deadly Heat in Nature Climate Change, to sort of show this as an example. So if you see this map, this is a map of the world. And in red are the places where we have documented a relationship between heat and mortality. And in blue are the places where there have been specific heat episodes that have been studied. So if we look at this map, we have a lot of heat episodes that have been documented and studied in Europe, in North America, in the US, some parts of Australia. I'm really happy to see some studies in India and some parts of China, but there are huge gaps. And so to sort of connect this to what I told you about climate change earlier, this is a map that shows places where deadly climate conditions are expected in a high emission scenario. So these are some of the areas where if we continue on our current path, we're going to see increasing numbers of days of deadly climate conditions, so deadly heat days. And oftentimes, those areas where we see those high numbers of days when you're going to reach a deadly heat threshold are the same areas where we don't have that research on what is the relationship between heat and deaths, and then where there have actually been studies on a specific heat episode. So there's a lot of gaps that need to be filled, particularly in Africa, South America, the maritime continent, and more. So now that we've seen the gaps, what are the opportunities? So my colleague, Erin Coughlin de Perez, did a study where she looked at 2 different types of forecasting models, and she said, okay, so where in the world can we actually predict heat in advance? So the green areas are where heat is seasonal. So there is some seasonality to heat. So for example, in India, we typically get extreme heat before the rainy season, so during April. So that gives us some sort of seasonality to be able to know every year April is around the time we should expect heat waves. And then the red is where there might be short-term forecasts. But most importantly, the gray areas are where you have predictability for both. So essentially, if you combine the number of people living in the areas that are colored on this map, that's 5 billion people. So we actually have a huge amount of opportunity in terms of the number of people that we could potentially cover in terms of heat warning systems with predictability for heat in advance. So what are we doing about it as the Red Cross? So one of the things that we're trying to do is fill in some of those gaps. So we worked with a couple of research institutions in the past couple of years, and we actually did a study on vulnerability and exposure in Kenya. So this is a picture of Kibera, which is the biggest slum in Africa. It's in Nairobi. And as you can see, slums are dense. They have tin housing, little vegetation, limited access to public services and utilities. And we did a study sort of trying to understand, we had a hunch that this slum was a temperature hotspot, a place where temperatures were higher than in other parts of the city. So we worked in this slum and 2 others, and we looked at the data over a period of 3 or 4 months to understand whether or not that was true. And so if you look at this graph on the bottom, essentially this line right here is a heat threshold, where above this line, essentially, we've seen an increased incidence of deaths related to temperature. And this line on the bottom, the dotted line, is the station that the Kenya Met Department uses to measure how hot it is. And then if you look at these 3 lines above it, those are the 3 stations within the 3 slums that we looked at. And consistently over this period, the temperature in these 3 slums was consistently higher than this threshold, and also higher than in the station that the Kenya Met Department measures. So what does this mean? It means that there are temperature hotspots within cities, so we can't just be looking at one station or station data that we have available. We need to be looking at how is the vulnerability and exposure also changing within a city, and how do we take that into account? Another thing that we did is we partnered with Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health, and we looked at the relationship between heat and mortality in Bangladesh. So we did a study, and essentially in the study we found that over an 8-day period in Bangladesh, we saw over 3,800 excess deaths linked to extreme heat. So taking this information, we worked with BBC Media Action to develop and disseminate messages related to risks of extreme heat. So for example, this is a Facebook page that they created called Amrai Pari, which had video messages sort of sharing what should you do if you are sort of exposed to extreme heat, what are some simple actions you can take. So they created a messaging campaign with us, and we reached over 3.9 million people. And I know I'm over time, so I'm going to finish this up quite quickly. So this is my last slide. So what are we doing next? So one thing that we're trying to do is raise awareness that this is a big research gap in terms of heat waves in developing countries. So we're working on writing a heat wave sign-on letter that indicates that heat waves are a priority for a broad coalition of organizations. And it highlights key research gaps and action gaps that we think we need to address this problem worldwide. And then we're also working on a city heat wave guide. So essentially, this is a guide for city managers with a focus on Asia and Africa on what you can do before, during, and after a heat wave to reduce the risk. And I'll leave it there, and I'll pass it on to my colleague, Wasila. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Okay. Hi. And And I think that was a nice segue to what we do at the NOAA's Climate Prediction Center. So I'm going to talk about real-time climate information for heat health early warning. And I'm going to begin by talking about predictability of heat waves in Africa. And we got engaged into this in 2018, so it's very recent. But you know that heat is a problem. It's a problem, as both Pete and Ruth has alluded to. It's a health problem for the globe. So at the Climate Prediction Center, we have been providing weather and climate information real time to the community, and we also have been working very closely with USAID, Famine Early Warning System, and also Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance to provide information tailored to food security and disaster risk reduction. So based on that experience, our leadership in NOAA funded the Climate Prediction Center to start looking into climate information for health, for human and animal health, focusing on infectious diseases but also on heat waves. So we've been working on this heat wave since 2018, and the objective is to evaluate the forecast quality of heat waves in Africa. But actually, our focus is really global. We're starting with Africa, but if we're successful, we hope that we can also translate that somewhere else in around the globe. So we're constructing historical weekly frequency of daily maximum heat index, or also minimum temperature for that matter, at various threshold values document the heat wave events. As you may know, what could be a heat wave for, say, like the Sahel may be different than Southern Africa or even Kenya or Canada and so forth. So really, it really depends on the sensitivity of the human population to temperature. So we define a heat wave as a weather event of 3 consecutive days with daily maximum temperature exceeding the 90th percentile, or 3 consecutive days with daily NOAA's heat index exceeding a threshold between 39 degrees Celsius and 42 degrees Celsius. That's about 102 Fahrenheit and 108 Fahrenheit. The heat index is a combination of temperature, air temperature, and the humidity. So it gives an indication of how the human body feels the temperature. So once we have defined those heat waves, now 39, 42 degrees, this is just looking at Africa. If we were to look at another part of the world, say like the Caribbean, we will have to lower this temperature because in the Caribbean about 33, 32 degrees, you start having heat waves. So then we can investigate the period of this event at the week 2 time scale. Now week 2 time scale means the prediction 8 days lead time. So 8 days from now, can we tell you if we're going to experience a heat wave or not? So that's the week 2 time scale. So for that, we use the forecast from the NCEP model, that is the Global Ensemble Forecast System, to assess the quality of the forecast. And then we can do experimental heat products for our climate health with our climate and health collaborators who can provide feedback and give us guidance toward an operational forecast system. So I talked about this already. So this is a heat wave event of 28 April 2016. And here we're looking at a heat index value greater than 40 degrees Celsius. So the left panel shows us that's the observation. That is the observation showing us the number of consecutive days for which the heat index is greater than 40 degrees Celsius, that is 104 degrees Fahrenheit, during the period between 22 April and 28 April 2016. So the right panel now is the forecast. It is 8 days before the event started. And what we're showing there is what is the likelihood for a heat wave event to occur in West Africa during this time. 8 days in advance, So what you see, what is colored on the right panel is the probability, the likelihood for a heat wave event to occur. So red means that you have a very high probability. You talk about 80 to 90% chance that heat wave will occur. So you can see that the model was able to depict the observed heat wave event. And the bottom panel here now is showing you the performance of the model over time. So we're looking at from 2017 to 2018, looking at all heat wave events in that period. And what you show in blue is the evaluation of the model for heat index, and in red, the evaluation of the model for maximum temperature. So in this verification matrix, this evaluation metric, which we call the area under the rock curve, for the model to be performing, we need to have values, skill score that are higher than 0.5. And you can see that for the blue, the heat index, for the period when we have heat wave, that is during the spring season, we have values exceeding 0.5, between 0.6 and 0.7, meaning that the model is highly performing for the heat index greater than 4 degrees Celsius. And we see that both for 2017 and for 2018. Now for the temperature, the maximum temperature that is greater of 90th percentile, the model during the spring season, the hot season, we see that the model performance is also above the 0.5 line, even though it's lower than the heat index. And that is due to the fact that there is the model has a a negative bias for maximum temperature. And this negative bias needs to be corrected in order to improve this forecast. So that's something that we're working on right now. So this is another case for Northern Africa, where we also have similar measures. So this time we're looking at these skill measures, and we can see that again the metric that we're using is way above 0.5 during the heat season. So when you see low skill, that is this area, is when you don't have heat wave at all. So this is the period when there is no heat wave. So but during the period when we have heat wave, you can see very clearly that the model is quite highly performing. And this is another way to show the skill map. Here we're using a different metric. And in this metric that we're using, anything that is orange to red means good skill. So that means that across the Sahel, for both the heat index greater than 4 degrees Celsius and the temperature maximum greater than 90th percentile, the model is quite performing. So, so these give us quite a good indication that we have low-hanging fruit in the predictability of heat wave events in those areas that we have looked at. So now this is the website. This is our website where we provide real-time climate information. And the bottom panel here is the website for heat wave that we are trying to populate. And hopefully, once we have confidence in this forecast, we can provide real-time information on heat waves using this platform. Thank you very much. And I'm going to pass it on to Hunter.
Okay, yes. My name is Hunter Jones, and I'm also at NOAA. I'm in the Climate Program Office, so that's on the research side. We fund a lot of research out of the office, and we also run some integrated information systems for drought and heat and other things. And I'm joined actually by my colleague Julie Turton, who's here as well. And what I'll talk about is actually a little bit bigger than NOAA. It's kind of a global network that we're developing, and so we're also representing, or Joy Shumak-Gimo at WMO, WHO is also involved in this presentation. So together with a lot of other people who are not listed here, we've developed a network that I want to talk about that will hopefully bring together a lot of the stuff that you've heard today, a lot of the interventions, a lot of the ideas, and kind of facilitate exchange for those ideas. And it's called GHIN, the Global Heat Health Information Network. So here's why we're doing GHIN. Practitioners around the world are taking action to manage heat risk. You heard a lot of these things today. And this is just a very simple kind of partial representation of some of those actions. And you can see in green are where there are heat health action plans. And actually, just the way that I took the screenshot, if you zoomed in, this H would kind of expand into plans that are kind of scattered around. So you can't really see where they are. But there are a lot of heat action plans that are documented on this map, and case studies. There are a ton of case studies. But even if you still zoom in, you'll see, and this is what Ruth was talking about, we could still use a lot better coverage in some of these developing areas. So we have some information for Africa. Again, I'm not sure why it's not all showing, but there is need for more of this information. So this is going on. There are a lot of people who are taking actions. They may not know about each other. They may not be in contact. So that's one of the big things that we wanted to address by developing a global network for heat health information. So another issue is people are taking these actions, but how do we make sure that they're taking these actions with the best available evidence, that they are able to find that evidence, and that they're all learning from each other? And so this is just an illustration of what some of the issues could be. In the upper left, you see a paper that says that wet bulb globe temperature is the gold standard for assessing environmental heat stress during physical activity. And in many cases it is. That's widely accepted. But there are also a lot of papers that have looked at the use of WBGT as a metric, and they've found that there are some issues with it. And so this isn't to say that it's good or bad necessarily, but that these are complicated issues, and there are a lot of things that need to be considered before you can just kind of implement these things. Another example is electric fans. This has been coming up a lot lately. Electric fan use is sometimes helpful, sometimes not. It depends on the level of humidity. It depends on the age of the person and their ability to sweat in order to thermoregulate. And so these are all really kind of complex factors that have to be considered. And the issue is some practitioners are very deep in the scientific literature and follow this stuff, and some don't necessarily follow all of the literature. So how do we make sure that this information is widely available and shared, and that it's easy to use? A final example is just heat early warning systems, which were also discussed earlier. It's really important to routinely go back and revise those thresholds and examine how they're working. So this is a paper just stating that. And as an example, the National Weather Service in the US did do that recently in New England. They actually found that the thresholds were set a little bit too high, and that if they lowered them, they would catch more heat health outcomes. So in order to bring people together, to build a network to help everyone learn from each other, we developed GHIN, which is a forum of scientists and practitioners for enhancing global to local learning for heat health risk reduction. That's the tagline there. And what GHIN is really, first and foremost, what you see around the edge here. It's people. It's everybody, the people in the room, I'm sure. It's all of the heat health experts, practitioners, scientists that are working on this issue in their own space and that would like to meet each other, both in their own regions and communities and then also across the world. So, and you might recognize these two down here in the lower right. These are all photos from the first big impactful thing that we did with GHIN. We've been planning this and developing it for a few years now, and we have had a lot of conversations, and we've considered a lot about how we might do this. But the big action that we took recently was in December in Hong Kong. We held a global forum, our first global forum on heat and health. And so that's something we'd like to do every couple of years and make sure we're kind of building this drumbeat and bringing people together from across the globe to talk about heat issues and to share their progress and their challenges. And at the top, you can see the 5 thematic areas that we focused on in the forum that I mentioned, the first global forum on heat and health, but also they're the thematic areas for the network generally. So these are the 5 areas where we think there's a lot of work to be done to understand and to share information. So how do you build partnerships and capacity to develop heat health management networks? How do you understand risk and predict the health outcomes? What's needed in terms of observations, forecasts, early warning systems, and other information products to inform early action? So both from a production side, what needs to be produced, but also what research needs to go into this. What actions are available to manage heat risk, and how do we evaluate their effectiveness? Fans come to mind. And then also communication, and this is all forms of communication. How do we communicate the issue in a general sense How do scientists better communicate risk when they're talking about a weather or climate forecast, for example? So GHIN is really set to do all of these things, and this first global forum is we had about a little over 100 people, I think, and representatives from 33 different countries come to this forum. And so that was kind of our baseline. We wanted to understand what could we do to help all of those people who were there, and also the people who participated remotely, and we hope that there's more remote participation in the future. So the answer is really these 4 goals that came up. We did a survey at the end, and we had a lot of conversations and collected a lot of feedback. But the 4 things that we want to focus on are improving the awareness and urgency for the silent disaster that increasing heat and heat waves pose to human health, improving the availability and awareness and synthesis and co-production of resources and information, facilitating a truly transdisciplinary approach that integrates practitioners and researchers. So that's, again, getting to that issue of practitioners sometimes not always being completely enveloped in the literature as a researcher might be, and vice versa, getting research information out to practitioners and making sure that it's being applied appropriately in practice. And then finally, focusing on science for action and speeding the transition of that research, as I was mentioning. We conducted a number of surveys at the end, and I just pulled a few of the findings from those surveys out. So we asked what services the community would like to have us provide. One of them was a synthesis report, not just to synthesize the science and what we know about heat waves, but really to synthesize what people were doing around the world, what were the operational gaps, and what were the best practices that we're finding. Also an online knowledge sharing platform and evidence reviews and inventories of good practice. And then to zoom into the online knowledge sharing platform, if you look at the next one on the upper right, how do we do that? What would you like to see? The answer was guidance and resources, synthesis of new findings, studies, and inventories of effective interventions. And then we also asked what level of networking would be very helpful. And this is a good finding, which was that people are, maybe they could use a little bit of help in their own countries and their own communities finding people, but what they really wanted was to find people who were in similar situations in, halfway around the world. So if you're working on urban heat island effect in Hong Kong, how do you find someone in New York City or in Atlanta that's dealing with perhaps certain similar conditions that you're struggling with? So how can we build those global communities of people that are kind of dealing with the same context? So over the next 2 to 5 years, GHIN will address these goals by developing a much more sophisticated web platform. We do have one. The link's on the next page, but we're going to be elaborating that a lot, putting a lot more case studies, interventions, country profiles, things like that on there. Also, the synthesis report we'll be working on in the future, and other ideas for in-person and virtual exchanges. And then, of course, the second global forum is something we're planning for 2020. So I'd love to see more people involved in that. So I'll end there, but the address is ghin.org, and this is a picture of everybody that was at the first forum. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. At this point, we'd like to open it up for discussion with all of you. And so I'd like to turn it to you and to also our audience online, and just see what types of comments and questions you might have. Yeah, a couple of questions back there. Thanks, Becca.
Oh. Hi, my name is Chris Lepperman. I'm with World Resources Institute. First of all, really great session. All of the diversity in terms of the true issues that underlie what's missed from the dynamic between extreme heat exposure and its impact on human health is really pertinent. Overall, one of my main questions that always stick out, and it would be great to get your perspectives on, is the fact that a lot of the responses that you require from all of the extreme heat warnings and emergency preparedness still hinges on personal behaviors. Can you all speak to some of what you've seen have worked in terms of getting people to change their behavior in response to some of these systems that have been put into place? And then also, I think the continued sort of advocacy around the fact that there are still research gaps out there in various areas of the world in regards to connecting the relationship between extreme heat and human health is really important. And I think addedly, if there's any opportunity to to connect that to what it means economically, I think can actually push forward the momentum in funding research for this particular area.
Thanks. Should we take another question right next to you, Danielle, and then we can kind of build on these? That was about changing, how do we incentivize changing personal behavior, research gaps, and dealing with economic inequalities?
Hi, I'm Danielle Miley with USAID's Climate Office. This was is a question for Hunter. The graphic that you showed at the beginning of your presentation showed the map and a little leaf where all the health action plans are being implemented. I just wondered if those were at the national or the city level, and does NOAA or does the network monitor the implementation and effectiveness? Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's the map.
Should we go ahead? We can add yours, and then we'll maybe stop there, and we can take a crack at this.
So I just want to add a little, so Julie Turton from NOAA. Thanks for doing this, actually. Appreciated hearing everybody on the same panel, having been on the other side of this. I want to add a little bit of timescale question to this. And you were asking about personal behavior, and I would actually ask the room also to engage the panel in a discussion of beyond personal behavior, institutional behaviors, about timescale. You know, who can be planning differently if you're a donor, if you're a funder, if you're a financial organization, if you're a city planner, what can we be doing on different timescales beyond just the personal response during a heat wave? So I'd really be interested in that conversation too.
Thank you. Any of you like to, Ruth, reaching for your mic, thanks.
Sure, I can start. So I think the question about incentivizing changes in behavior is a really good one and a difficult one. So one example that I like to point to, there's a study done in England where they asked people, so elderly people who were on medication, who were clearly at risk of potentially being affected by extreme heat. They asked them, are you worried about what would happen to you if there was a heat wave? And all of their responses were essentially, no, I'm not at risk. You should worry about all those other old people. So I think it's a real big problem, and something that we should learn from. Like, there's a lot of public health literature out there on behavior change, and I think we can learn from it. But I also want to point to what Julie said in terms of there's a lot of actions that don't rely just on personal behavior change. So for example, if you're looking at the seasonal time scale and you know that heat waves occur during these 3 months of the year, you can start planning trainings with community health workers, with doctors, sort of saying, how do you recognize the signs of extreme heat? So the institutional actions, I think, are also really important.
Yeah, so I would just add to that, yes, there's absolutely a lot that can be done on a longer time scale that doesn't necessarily require direct personal action, though that's always helpful too. And a lot of these things that can be done on longer time scales, you know, the traditional mode that people think about heat waves in, at least initially, often is heat action planning and heat early warning systems. And that implies that, you know, once there's an alert, then you start taking these actions. And you do some things to prepare in advance so that you kind of wire up who does what. But a lot of it's kind of predicated on this alert taking place. And so what's really promising about improved predictions that are going out at longer timescales is that we can start talking to people and showing them new information that maybe hadn't been available in the past on seasonal and subseasonal timescales, reliable weather and climate information. And we can start having conversations about what actions could be taken at those timescales. I had a meeting in October that I ran. It was a workshop, and we did that. We talked. I brought together emergency managers and city planners, so people who think at different timescales typically. And I broke them up and made them sit into groups together. And so I was having, you know, the emergency managers talking to the city planners, talking to the public health experts, talking to somebody from an energy company. And I had them think about interventions at various timescales and just kind of breaking that up and getting them to think about that. At the end, they reported they were really surprised. There were a lot more things they could do in the long run that they hadn't thought about. Another thing about communications and behavior is I think analogs are powerful and we could use them more often. So in the weather and climate community, an analog is just kind of looking, if we predict a particular event that might be coming in a week or two, you can then look backwards in time and say, oh, 10 years ago there was an event that was similar to this. It's not necessarily the same, but similar, and this is what happened, and this many people died or went to the hospital. So think about that psychologically. I think it's a helpful model to have people think about the last time they experienced similar conditions, and it might have them think about what they could do this time to prepare differently. And then lastly, just to answer the question about heat action plans, they're at all levels. So we have things at the city, state, and national level. I know in Australia they have them at the state level. It kind of depends on the level that they've been prepared. I think different communities do them differently. Chicago has one for the city, so things like that. And then there are a lot of them on there, so I'd encourage you to go look at them, and also please share more if you see that there are gaps. I think you can submit some there's a form that you can use to submit them.
Thanks. I'll just add one piece of information about the heat health action plan that I put up there from Ahmedabad, which is that it was developed after a very severe heat event took place and took the lives of many. I don't remember the number, but it was unfortunately, something that was pointed to as a solution, or at least as an intervention after a real catastrophic event. And I think that is one of the realities that we're dealing with, in that we react once it's really brought into our face. And so hopefully we can mobilize, hopefully we can kind of create, get around that issue of, oh, I'm fine, it's not me, it's someone else, and work in interdisciplinary. That's a real interesting anecdote that Hunter brought in about the multi-stakeholder interdisciplinary teams that came together to kind of figure out, well, what are their roles, how can they work together, and that's a real critical piece for something like a heat health action plan. That's the one. Wasil, did you want to add anything around the research gaps piece?
I think that also on the the changing behaviors, I think that it's a real issue, and particularly the developing countries, that many people are really resilient to change, and it's a big problem. So most of the countries in the developing world, they do not even have heat action plans. Mm-hmm. So this is really something new that we are really trying to address now, and it's going to take time. But I can tell you that in many countries, I know in Africa, for instance, fishermen, they die every single day going to sea. Even though, we know how to do marine forecasting, that's a daily time scale, skill very high, and you tell them, hey, waves are going to be extremely high, going to be dangerous to go in sea and fish, and yet they ignore those signals, and they do go. And I know a particular country where actually now they're working with police officers, to send them information and make sure that, they are, right there and, looking for people that will not obey the signal and would go to the seas. So it's a real problem. I think we're going to get there at some point, but it requires education. It requires, institutional engagement and policies and enforcement also for people to obey. So that's it. We could provide people with the best forecast, but if there is no plan and also people do not want to really listen, it won't work. But I think we can get there with time.
Other questions from the audience? We might wait for the microphone just because there's people online.
The folks online can hear you. And do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Terry Hill. I'm with the Passive House Institute and the eMerge Alliance, okay? One is energy efficient buildings and the other is bringing back direct current. And put those two together and you've got an interesting, and one of the benefits of the Passive House design or method is energy efficient and healthy buildings. And how big a problem is this heat issue? It's only sort of coming up on my radar recently. I know I'm here today, but that's one of the questions I have. How big is it? And is this work tying into building standards, you know, the availability of electricity? How can all this be put together? And the other interesting, would you be using artificial intelligence to do this forward-looking prediction modeling and have it be sort of semi-automatic or automatic? Sorry, thanks.
Hi, I'm Sarah Lina with the Climate Change Group at the World Bank. My question pertains to issues of capacity of Met offices in developing countries. So many developing countries have, you know, understaffed, under-resourced Met offices. So this first point on the action plan, which is a forecast, triggers, you know, the rest of the plan. What are your thoughts on ways to overcome kind of that challenge if those resources are not in place?
Karen Florini with Climate Central. A threshold, no pun intended question, at what point is heat risk unmanageable in as much as the only thing you can do to make it survivable is put people in cooling centers? I think I read somewhere that it's been estimated that above 95 degrees and 90% humidity, heat begins to be unsurvivable over a period of hours. Is that in fact the right, I mean, is there clear science as to what the unsurvivable number is, and how close are we to getting to that, and what are the predictions, you know, assuming we stay at the 8.5 RCP emissions level, when are we likely to get there?
Okay, another great set of questions from the audience. Thank you. So how big of an issue is this? What about building standards, AI and forecasting improvements in general, capacity gaps in Met offices in developing countries, and what point are we sort of, what's the threshold, and where does human health sort of reach its limit? Anybody on the panel? Wasila?
I think that on that last question, it really depends on the locality. So there are areas where, I'm not going to use Fahrenheit, but I'm going to use Celsius, where 25 degrees Celsius, you know, for 3-4 consecutive days is a problem, you know, could trigger health issues. And there are countries where it needs to be above 40 degrees Celsius for you really to start worrying about, you know, people, you know, getting really sick, you know, from the health. So it really depends on the locality. It's not like, you know, one single threshold temperature that would work for every locality.
Above, I mean, is 40 the survivable maximum?
That I do not know. Because I'm not a medical doctor, so but Julie may have an answer to that.
So I'm not a medical doctor. Let me just be upfront, and I suspect that you know, Hunter can answer some of this too here. But the point of Wasila's context is that it is very place dependent. So you know, 40 degrees, right, but there isn't a warmest where human existence is threatened that we have as a number, right? But when you look at the projections of, you know, from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and those sorts of things, we're looking at the number of days where you're above the 95th percentile is 45, 50 days more than normal in the next 20 years. 30 years. I mean, that does vary across this and with different levels of certainty. But that is, you know, I'm envisioning the map in front of me. Those are known. Those are out there. We actually didn't put that out up front because we were just talking about the networks. But there is a real risk of, and projected on different scenario, climate scenario pathways about the increased heat risk. And that's part of why we started this global network, because we know we're going to have more of these heat events. It was about 10,000 people that died in the Ahmedabad, the first heat wave. We have more. We have outdoor workers who are continually exposed. So it affects the health. Your point is we don't have really great economic numbers, and that's quite true. And maybe some of you in the room can help with that. But people are dying. They're dying now, and the heat waves are going to get more. And I guess the other part that I was thinking Wasila could probably also address is that it's not just the heat wave. It's, are they earlier in the season? What is the nighttime temperature? Because how cool it gets at night has a lot to do with the ability of the ecosystem and the humans to recover. How many in a row are we going to have? What's the time between them? So there's a lot about the character of the heat waves, when they come, how frequently and how intense, that is also going to change to be more frequent and more intense. And we're not well adapted in a timely fashion for that. So that isn't a medical answer, but it is a long-term change and why we're so concerned about it answer. Sorry.
Thanks. I think that also sort of gets at one of that first question around how big of a deal is this. I mean, it is a big deal. This is something that has already been causing deaths around the world and is projected to become even more of a bigger deal as we go into a warming world. And the urban heat island effect, where you don't have the ability for that urban environment to really scrub off its heat at night, and so it doesn't cool down. That's an issue that's a real challenge in urban areas, and it also gets to the point of an earlier question around economic inequalities. And there's roles for, I think, so many different stakeholders within this in terms of solutions and in terms of coming together to find ways to reduce the vulnerability. And clearly there will be points in certain areas where it's just unmanageable, and it really is about cooling centers, and that's been something that others have advocated for, is that access to cooling is actually a critical component in being able to reach the SDGs, or some of the SDGs. The private sector has a role, I think, in some of this, and there's opportunities there for investments and high efficiencies around cooling centers and cooling stations, and who has access to those. How can we make them equitable? I'll stop there and see if others would like to chime in on this.
I would just add that, so yes, there are some frightening scenarios that have been postulated in papers and in assessments, but all of this is within the realm of possibility. These mitigative and adaptive actions that we can take before we get to, some point where cooling centers are really, they're already an effective in many cases and useful tool, but there are a lot of other options that we have if we think about a longer time scale. And so the question about building standards and about electricity, those are things that I think about a lot. So perhaps in some places they are considering climate scenarios in building, but it's not necessarily something that's always encoded in the codes that are being followed when buildings are being constructed. So there are a lot of opportunities to infuse climate information to plan smarter that maybe aren't all being taken into consideration right now. Another example, so a lot of people think about building standards for energy efficiency and maybe building materials that don't capture as much heat energy during the day and then release it at night, which is the urban heat island effect. But there are also big picture ideas that people are thinking about in places like Hong Kong, for example. So I learned this because we were there for the forum, about the urban canyons, the way that cities could be designed, especially really vertical cities like Hong Kong, to channel wind in certain ways that you actually can reduce the heat that's being experienced by people on the ground. So there are a lot of really great ideas that are out there, and I think the more that we look into them and start investing in those ideas now, the better off we'll be in the long run, so we don't reach these kind of frightening futures. And then just to talk about electricity for a second, yes, the cascading failures and if you're if you're hoping that people running their air conditioning units or using cooling centers is a really good option, it is in some cases, but it also requires electricity. And we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but it also contributes to other problems, including kind of throwing off that excess heat back in the urban environment if everyone's running their window units or what have you. And then to take this back one more time to planning on electricity, to avoid brownouts or blackouts that might have to take place during a heat wave, I think there are opportunities to use more climate information in energy situations as well. So I've had conversations with people who work for the energy industry, and at the moment, often they'll do planning for the future, but they might use historical climate information as opposed to climate projections. So there are a lot of opportunities to use this information that's being produced in a different way, and I think it's exciting to explore those. Yeah.
And maybe I'll just add just a couple points. I think what Hunter mentioned is really important in terms of making sure that we're not just doing early warning systems, but also given that the rate of urbanization that we're going to see in the next 20 to 50 years is way higher than we've seen in the past. We have a huge opportunity to plan how those urban areas are going to look for the problems of the future. But on the question of how big of a problem is it and why we haven't heard more of it, I think so some of you mentioned that it's a silent disaster, and that's true because of the fact that like if there's a heat wave, you don't necessarily see the same images on your TVs of like people drowning in water that you would with the flood. So even though we have these huge statistics of like thousands of people dying during heat waves, those tend to be in hospitals, in their homes, and it's not something that's quite as public as a flood or a drought might be. So that might be part of the reason why you haven't heard of it quite as often. And then there was another one. Oh, okay. So your point about at what point is heat unsurvivable? So I showed that one of those graphics earlier about the RCP 8.5 scenario. So essentially that paper did that analysis. So they decided at what point would the heat and humidity combined for different regions of the Earth become sort of a threshold, they decided, at which point the human body would no longer be able to thermoregulate. And then they looked at the scenarios for projections in the future, and then that map was actually showing you the number of days you would have those deadly climate conditions in the future under an 8.5 scenario. So that's been done, and it's yeah, it was.
About national meteorological services, and I think that is important, critical, because obviously heat is a problem, but if we're going to solve the problem of heat, the Met services have to be at the forefront because they're the one providing the analysis and also the forecast, and those forecasts need to be reliable in order that society could use them to really prevent diseases from heat waves. So it's a problem that we're working on, but also it's a new problem for meteorological services. So at NOAA, with this grant that we have received, we're working with 2 pilot countries in Africa to try to develop heat wave forecasts and also make sure that we bring in the Ministry of Health as well into the discussion so that we can work together with them and see how we could create the synergy to really enable the use of climate information for health decision making in heat health, in the case of heat waves. So it's something in the work, but I think it will take a lot of time to really develop that capacity at Met Services. But I agree with you that they have to be at the forefront of this issue of heat waves.
Just on that, USAID has been investing in capacity development in Met agencies and really seeing that as a critical investment for not just dealing with heat waves, but dealing with other types of there's so many uses for predicted information about weather and climate, and applying that to different sectors, whether it's agriculture, water resource management, disaster risk reduction. There's just so much that we rely on in our Met agencies, and building that capacity is really critical.
So this question is from Astrid Caldas from the Union of Concerned Scientists, and she is curious as to whether any of you have information on the effectiveness of warning systems. Studies say that they are effective and are reflected on reduced visits to the ER, on morbidity and mortality, but if the warnings become very common in an increasingly hot environment or a city or a place, do people stop heeding them, and do authorities put them at a level so as not to be, so that they don't become super common, such that people are no longer responding to them?
That's a great question. Myself, I'm not aware of that, although I'm definitely aware of the need to make the evaluations on early warning systems so that we can answer that question and so that we can improve upon them. But perhaps my colleagues have more specifics that they're familiar with around that.
There is some information in the literature, but it's I think the net results are that they are positive, but it's complicated to really determine the effectiveness because there are so many variables. So what I would say instead is that the reason it's so challenging is because we don't have really great information on morbidity and mortality. There are a number of reasons for that. Some of it has to do with the fact that when people, it's not going to say that somebody died of a heat wave on their death certificate. It's going to say something else like that they had a heart attack. And so there are a number of ways in which heat contributes to what is ultimately the cause of somebody's death, but it's really difficult to kind of trace the contribution of heat to that. And then even if you do get all of these deaths associated with heat coded correctly, the information is very private because it's health information. And so just getting the information is a challenge in a lot of cases, and then getting the right number of deaths that you can attribute to heat waves is a challenge. And then because you're doing this in reality and not in a controlled system, it's also very hard to evaluate. So I know I'm not exactly answering the question, but I think there is evidence, and there are studies in the literature. I can find some after the fact that I can share. But what we're trying to do, one of the many things we're trying to do with GHIN and also with the national program that's related to GHIN that we're running out of NOAA that's called NIHIS, the National Integrated Heat Health Information System, is to just to help people get more information so that they can assess things like that.
Are there other questions or comments that you all would like to make and contribute to the conversation?
I'm Mark Goldberg with the Climate Institute. I want to ask a question that pivots off of something that was mentioned early in the session, which is differential vulnerabilities of different. Okay. Start again? All right. Sorry. Anyway, Mark Goldberg, Climate Institute. I want to go back to the notion of differential vulnerabilities and focus in particular on the fact that in many countries, the proportion of the population that is older is increasing pretty rapidly and projected to do so over the next 20 or 30 years. How might that affect calculations of the threshold that we've been talking about, and how does it affect the urgency of all this work?
Well, I think that that point about different vulnerabilities is really important. And so without even focusing on the projection of the populations in the sense of their ages, it's just really important to continue to examine the populations that we're trying to serve such that we're understanding where the vulnerabilities are and the recommendations and the recommendations that are being promoted really are targeting the right people so that it's targeting the most vulnerable and targeting others that are, as the vulnerability profile changes of a community, that needs to be examined and that needs to be understood. And then we have to make sure that the whatever health action plan or whatever else the intervention may be is effectively targeting that group of people.
Yeah, maybe I would just add that in relation to what Pete just said, so if your interventions were normally things like cooling centers, for example, you would have to start considering how do the particular makeup of my country, how do they reach these cooling centers? So if it's an elderly population, are all of the people able to drive? So if not, then you might have to start considering, do I also need a busing program in place? Are there an increasing number of nursing homes where people just aren't able to sort of get all these people to a cooling center? So is there a different thing that we would need to do to accommodate for particular vulnerability? So I think it's starting to get more in depth and in detail on what are the particular people who are at risk, and then how do we tailor the interventions to those people so that we're actually meeting their needs.
Well, it seems like we may be running down on the questions and the comments, but I know I've enjoyed the conversation. I've learned a lot from my fellow panelists and from you, from the audience, in terms of where you're coming from and where your questions and comments are. So I just want to thank you and thank my panelists, and I think that that can conclude our, Becca, did you have a last word?
I'll say thank you also. Yes, thank you, Pete. Thank you, Roop, Wasilla, and Hunter for being here today, and everyone who came out, especially on a rainy day like today. It was great to hear from all of these different perspectives, and also a fruitful discussion at the end. So just to thank you all on behalf of the Atlas team for joining us. And as a follow-up as well, the PowerPoint slides will be projected. I know folks were taking a couple photos, but these will be shared online through Climatelinks.org, which is where this event was published, and we'll also be sharing a recording of the webinar as well. So that will be up in the next week or so, as well as additional information about upcoming. The next adaptation community meeting, Chris mentioned at the beginning of this meeting, the next one is scheduled for Thursday, April 18th. And the topic will be looking at the intersection of climate risk and integrated water resources management. So just kind of a note on where you can find additional resources related to this talk today, and as well as the upcoming adaptation community meetings. So thank you all again for joining us today.